Today I'm with Lloyd Sampson, pharmacist and director of a non-for-profit organization in Australia that promotes the protection of patients in clinical trials. Lloyd, how did you originally get into this line of work?
Oh, I've been a user of ethics committees through my research. I've chaired an ethics committee, and now I'm a director of a company that actually provides ethical services to private researchers in Australia and then donates the money from that to research.
What are those main issues facing the welfare of participants in trials?
It's a fine balance between trying to promote people's participation in research, but at the same time ensuring that their well-being is the primacy of it. It is also now very important, I think, for us to determine that the clinical trial that is proposed is likely to achieve the outcome which is desired. That's why ethics committees do have to have a wide range of expertise around the table, from social science to physical, biological science, and now in molecular biology and so on. Let me just give you an example of that. In virtually all trials for cancer drugs today, the trial allows for patients in the control arm to switch to the active arm if they progress during the course of the trial. But how you analyse that data is critical. And so if you don't think about how you're going to analyse the data before you get it, then you can end up with data which is meaningless. And that means people are at risk with absolutely no benefit to the knowledge. So an unscientific study is an unethical study. So ethics committees are responsible not only for looking at whether or not the patient is properly informed, whether or not the risk is adequate, and whether there's undue influence on the participants. Because participants in trials range from healthy volunteers right through to people who have a very severe disease, and so their attitudes and beliefs and their risk, if you like, their capacity to accept risk is different. So you have to make sure that the context of the research is appropriate.
And that brings me to another question. So one of the most notorious examples of harm gone wrong in a clinical trial was with the leukemia drug TGN-1412, and it was tested in 8 healthy male volunteers, and almost an hour after they took it, 6 of them went into multi-organ failure and rushed to the hospital critical care. And so these patients were paid £2,000 to participate in the trial. So what do you think are the ethical considerations around paying for participation in clinical trials?
I have no difficulty with payment of participants in clinical trials, predominantly to cover their expenses and their time. But there's a fine line between when does the amount of money make your risk taking less acceptable. All right, so if I do it for $2,000, the risk is not worth it. If you pay me $20,000, then I'll change my risk. That is, I think, is the problem.
How you set that level of exploitation.
Yes, exactly. Mm-hmm. So then you need, I don't oppose payment and recompense of participants in trials. They do have expenses and so on. But as I said, there is that line, and that's where one of the things that ethics committees have to weigh up is the amount that's being offered commensurate with the time involved and so on, because we don't want people to do trials simply because they're being paid so much money that the risk becomes irrelevant because the money dominates. That's a tragedy. In terms of the specific trial, I mean, no trial will ever be 100% safe. And the reason for that is because we're doing the trial to get more knowledge. So we don't have all of the knowledge to start with. So there is that risk. What we've got to ensure that risk is minimised as much as we possibly can, that the collective of the data that we look at before we go into first time in man is as robust as we can. And so that's the science. All right, but there are some studies where you look at the data and you say, well, that was idiosyncratic. We could not have predicted that. In other trials where there's been serious outcomes, in retrospect, you look at it and say, that was the signal. So that's why you just have to be careful, prudent, and very thorough when you evaluate a protocol.
So what value do you think pharmacists can add in terms of protecting participants in clinical trials?
I know patients have got a consumer focus, that's point one. They bring scientific, they bring ethical issues. I mean, on a daily basis, pharmacists in practice are dealing with ethical dilemmas. And so there is absolutely no question every ethics committee requires a pharmacist. That's to me, just a statement of fact. And that any ethics committee that does not have a pharmacist doesn't have that range of expertise.
Well, thank you so much. It's been fascinating talking with you today.
Thank you very much.
This is Whitley Yee at the FIP Congress in Glasgow.